Hertfordshire, England, April 1818. The morning mist clung to the windows of Silverton Hall like a cold grey veil, refusing to release its grip on the estate that had stood silent, its very stones seeming to hold their breath in perpetual sorrow. Miss Arabella Winters stood in the centre of the east drawing-room, her worn travelling dress of grey wool a stark contrast to the faded grandeur surrounding her, and wondered if accepting this position had been the greatest mistake of her 26 years. The agency had warned her. 5 governesses in 18 months. The Duke of Silverton was impossible to please, his children unmanageable, his household a place where hope came to die. But Arabella had nowhere else to go. Her father's gambling debts had consumed everything, including her future, and governesses with her particular qualifications were uncommon enough that she could not afford to be selective. The door opened without ceremony, and Arabella's muscles tensed despite her best efforts to remain composed. If stories of extraordinary women silenced by society's cruelest judgments move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Edmund Hartwell, Duke of Silverton, entered the room with the bearing of a man who had long ago decided that feeling anything was too dangerous to permit. He was tall, perhaps 35 years, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the colour of winter storms. His coat was immaculately tailored, his cravat tied with unyielding exactitude, but there was something in the rigid set of his shoulders that spoke of a man carrying grief so heavy it had become part of his skeleton. He did not greet her. Instead, he circled her slowly, as one might inspect a horse at auction, and Arabella kept her spine straight through sheer determination. "Miss Winters," he said at last, his voice cold and clipped. "The agency claims you speak 5 languages, French, Italian, German, Latin, and naturally English." "6 languages, Your Grace," Arabella corrected quietly. "I also speak ancient Greek." The Duke stopped his inspection and faced her directly. His expression was one of thinly veiled contempt. "6 languages. How remarkably convenient for a woman of your circumstances." Arabella felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but kept her voice steady. "My father believed in education, Your Grace, before his circumstances deteriorated." "Your father?" The Duke's lip curled with distaste. "Richard Winters, a merchant who gambled away his fortune and died owing money to half of London. Tell me, Miss Winters, did he teach you these languages before or after he squandered everything on cards and poor investments?" The words struck like physical blows, each one finding its mark with practiced cruelty. Arabella absorbed the wound, the sickeningly familiar burn of shame and profound inadequacy that had haunted her since her father's disgraceful death and financial ruin. But beneath the shame and pain, something else entirely was stirring powerfully within her. "My father sent me to be educated at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in France when I was 8 years old, Your Grace. I remained there for 18 years. The sisters were generous enough to provide me with an education that extended far beyond what most young ladies receive." "A convent," the Duke's voice dripped with disdain. "How exceedingly fortunate. And now you arrive at my door claiming linguistic mastery, expecting me to believe that a woman of your station has achieved what most university scholars cannot. Tell me, Miss Winters, do you think me a fool?" Arabella felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the careful composure she had maintained throughout her adult life. "I do not think you a fool, Your Grace. I think you a man who has forgotten what kindness looks like." The silence that followed stretched taut between them, an absolute fragile thing. The Duke's eyes narrowed dangerously, and for a moment Arabella thought she had just ended her employment before it had truly begun. But then he smiled, and it was the coldest expression she had ever seen on a human face. "Kindness," he repeated softly. "What a quaint notion. Let me be clear, Miss Winters, I do not require kindness from my children's governess. I require competence, discipline, and above all, the ability to remember one's place. You are here because my children have driven away every other candidate. You are, quite literally, my last option. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "You will teach my children according to the curriculum I have established. You will not coddle them. You will not excuse poor performance, and you will not fill their heads with romantic nonsense about following their hearts or pursuing their passions. The world is cruel, Miss Winters, and my children must be prepared to face it with steel in their spines, not dreams in their heads. Can you do this? Arabella thought of the convent, of the patient sisters who had taught her that true strength came not from hardness but from resilience rooted in love. She thought of her father, who had believed in beauty and possibility even as the world crumbled around him. And she thought of the 3 children somewhere in this cold house who had lost their mother, and it seemed their father as well. "I can teach your children, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Whether I will teach them in the manner you describe remains to be seen." The Duke's expression darkened dangerously. "You presume a great deal for a woman in your position?" "I presume nothing, Your Grace. I simply state a fact. I will teach your children to the best of my considerable ability. But I will also teach them that knowledge is not merely a weapon against the world, but a gift that opens doors to understanding, compassion, and genuine joy. If that does not suit your requirements, I will leave immediately and save us both the inevitable disappointment." For a long moment the Duke simply stared at her, and Arabella could not read the expression in his storm-grey eyes. Then abruptly he turned toward the door. "You will begin tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock precisely. Mrs. Dalton will show you to your rooms and introduce you to the children. Do not disappoint me, Miss Winters. I have very little patience remaining for anyone or anything." He left without waiting for her response, and Arabella found herself alone once more in the faded elegance of the drawing-room. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly. She had just challenged a duke in his own home, had spoken to him with a directness that would have horrified the gentle sisters at the convent. But as she stood there in the cold morning light, she found she did not regret it. Something was profoundly wrong in this house, and those children needed more than discipline and cold efficiency. They needed someone who remembered what it was to be young, lost and afraid. They needed someone who understood that sometimes the bravest thing one could do was simply refuse to become hard. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, appeared in the doorway moments later, her weathered face carefully neutral. "If you will follow me, miss, I will show you to the schoolroom and your chambers." As Arabella followed the older woman through the labyrinthine corridors of Silverton Hall, she could not shake the feeling that she had just set something in motion that could not be easily stopped. The house itself seemed to watch her progress with the attention of something sentient and sorrowful, its shadows deeper than mere absence of light, its silence more profound than simple quiet. What had happened here to make a home feel so much like a tomb? Mrs. Dalton led her up a grand staircase, its banister carved with exquisite detail but dulled by years of inadequate polishing, and down another corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow their progress with disapproval. "The children's wing is here," the housekeeper said, stopping before a heavy oak door. "Master James is 13, Master Oliver is 10, and Miss Caroline is 7. They are in the schoolroom now, waiting." "And their mother?" Arabella asked gently. "The agency mentioned she passed 4 years ago." Mrs. Dalton's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "The Duchess Rosalind was a kind woman, miss, very kind indeed. The children have not been the same since she left us, nor has His Grace, truth be told." "What happened to her?" "Fever, miss. Took her in less than a week. His Grace was away in London attending to parliamentary business when she fell ill. By the time word reached him and he returned home, she was already gone." The housekeeper's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He never forgave himself for not being here when she needed him most, and I fear the children believe he blames them somehow for requiring his attention when their mother required it more." The words painted a picture of grief so profound it had poisoned an entire household, and Arabella ached for children she had not yet met. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Dalton. You seem different from the others, miss. Stronger, perhaps. The children need someone strong, but they also need someone kind. His Grace may have forgotten the value of kindness, but I pray you remember it." Before Arabella could respond, the housekeeper opened the door to the schoolroom, and 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her with expressions that ranged from wary hope to outright hostility. The boy, sitting ramrod straight at the largest desk, could only be James, the heir to the dukedom. He had his father's dark hair and grey eyes, but where the Duke's face was hard with controlled emotion, James's showed the terrible tension of a child desperately trying to achieve an impossible standard of perfection. His desk was immaculate, every book aligned with geometric precision, every pen positioned at exact angles. He stood immediately upon her entrance, bowing with mechanical formality. "Good morning, miss. I am James Hartwell, heir to the Dukedom of Silverton. I trust you will find my studies satisfactory and my conduct beyond reproach." The formal words from a 13-year-old child broke Arabella's heart a little. This was not a boy, she thought. This was a small soldier performing endless drills in hopes of pleasing an impossible commander who never showed satisfaction. The second boy, Oliver, sat at a desk near the window, and unlike his brother, he did not stand when she entered. His sandy hair fell across his forehead in a way that suggested his rebellion against the house's rigid standards, and his fingers were stained with what looked like charcoal or ink. He regarded Arabella with an expression of profound suspicion, as though she was simply another adult who would inevitably disappoint him and then abandon him like all the others. "Master Oliver," she said gently. "Good morning." He said nothing in response, but his hands moved slightly as though hiding something beneath the desktop. And then there was Caroline. The little girl sat at the smallest desk, positioned slightly apart from her brothers, as though she had voluntarily removed herself from their company. She was so perfectly still, she might have been a porcelain doll placed there for decoration. Her dark curls were neatly arranged, her dress perfectly pressed, her small hands folded with unnatural care on the desktop. But it was her eyes that struck Arabella most profoundly and painfully. They were the same storm grey as her father's and brothers, but they held something that made Arabella's throat tighten with unshed tears. They held nothing at all. No hope, no fear, no curiosity, no spark of childhood joy. Just a vast, terrible emptiness that no 7-year-old child should ever know. Mrs. Dalton had mentioned the girl had not spoken since her mother's death. Looking at that small, silent face, Arabella understood with sudden, devastating clarity that Caroline had not merely lost her voice. She had lost herself somewhere in the depths of grief and trauma, and no one had helped her find her way back. "Good morning, Miss Caroline," Arabella said softly, moving to kneel beside the child's desk so their eyes were level, rather than forcing the little girl to look up at yet another towering adult figure. "My name is Arabella. I am very pleased to meet you." The little girl's expression did not change, but something flickered briefly in those empty grey eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or simply surprise that an adult would kneel rather than tower over her with demands and expectations. Arabella rose gracefully and moved to the front of the room, turning to face all three children. She took a deep breath, feeling the enormous weight of this moment, understanding with absolute clarity that what she said next would set the tone for everything that followed. "I know you have had many governesses before me," she began, her voice clear but genuinely warm. "I know you may believe I am just another temporary presence who will soon leave you, just as all the others did. I cannot promise I will stay forever, because life is uncertain and circumstances change. But I can promise you this with complete honesty. While I am here, I will truly see you. Not as problems to be solved, or burdens to be managed, or disappointing failures to be corrected, but as the remarkable human beings you already are. And I will teach you not merely because your father commands it, but because you deserve to know how truly extraordinary the world can be when we approach it with open minds and brave hearts." James's perfect military posture wavered slightly, as though her words had struck something deep inside him that he had thought long buried and inaccessible. Oliver's suspicious expression softened almost imperceptibly, the rigid defensiveness in his shoulders easing by perhaps a single degree. And Caroline, silent Caroline with her empty eyes, simply stared at her with an intensity that suggested she was hearing words she had desperately needed to hear, but had never expected anyone would speak. But in that stare, Arabella thought she detected the faintest glimmer of something that might, with infinite patience and genuine care, eventually grow into hope. "Now," she continued, moving to the chalkboard with its accumulation of dust and old lessons never fully erased, "before we begin our formal academic lessons, I would like to know what each of you loves most in the world, not what you are supposed to love, not what your father wishes you to love or what society expects you to love, but what genuinely makes your heart sing when you think about it. Master James, will you begin? The boy looked utterly confounded by the question, as though she had asked him to solve an impossible mathematical equation using only philosophical principles. I am supposed to love my studies, miss. Latin and ancient Greek and mathematics and history and proper deportment. Those are academic subjects, Master James, not loves. Let me ask the question differently. If you could spend an entire day doing anything you wished, with absolutely no one to judge you or tell you otherwise, what would you choose to do? James's face went through several rapid transformations that were painful to witness. Confusion, because no one had ever asked him such a question. Fear, because answering honestly might reveal weakness or improper desires. Longing, because somewhere deep inside him, a small voice remembered what it was to want something simply for the joy of it. And finally, a terrible sort of resignation, as though he had just remembered that wanting things was pointless and dangerous. I do not know, miss. I have not thought about such frivolous things in a very long time. At 13 years old, this child had already learned to bury his genuine desires so deeply that he could not even name them anymore. Arabella felt a surge of anger toward the Duke, which she quickly suppressed because anger would help absolutely no one in this situation. Very well. That is an honest answer, and I respect honesty above all things. We shall return to that question another day, when you have had time to consider it more carefully. Master Oliver, what about you? The boy's hands tightened visibly on whatever object he was concealing beneath the desktop. Nothing, he said flatly, his voice hard with practiced defensive indifference. I love nothing at all. An interesting philosophical position, Arabella replied gently, without any hint of mockery or disbelief. But I suspect not entirely truthful. What are you hiding beneath your desk, Master Oliver? The boy's face went pale, then flushed with sudden defiance. Nothing that concerns you or anyone else. Perhaps not, but I am curious by nature, and I give you my word that I will not judge whatever you choose to show me. Will you trust me enough to share it? For a long moment Oliver simply stared at her, clearly weighing the considerable risks of vulnerability against the faint possibility that this adult might be different from all the others who had dismissed or punished him. Then, with a movement so quick it was almost violent, as though he needed to act before his courage failed entirely, he pulled out a leather-bound sketch pad and slammed it onto the desktop with unnecessary force. Arabella moved closer, and what she saw made her breath catch in genuine surprise and admiration. The pages were filled with drawings of truly breathtaking skill and emotional depth, landscapes rendered with delicate precision that captured not merely physical details, but atmospheric mood, portraits that revealed not just physical features, but emotional truth and psychological complexity. Studies of light and shadow that demonstrated an understanding of artistic technique far beyond what anyone would expect from a 10-year-old child. These were not the idle scribbles of a boy passing time between more important activities. These were the works of someone with genuine, rare artistic gift. Master Oliver, she said softly, reverently even, these are absolutely extraordinary. The boy's face crumpled slightly, as though he had braced himself for mockery or dismissal, and could not quite process genuine praise. Father says, art is for fools and wastrels who have nothing better to do with their time. He burned an entire collection of my drawings once when he found them. I hide everything now. The casual cruelty of that statement struck Arabella like a physical blow to the chest, but she kept her voice carefully level and warm. Your father is wrong, Master Oliver. Completely and utterly wrong. Art is not for fools. It is for those brave enough to see the world as it truly is and skilled enough to share that unique vision with others. You have a precious gift, a truly rare gift that many people spend entire lifetimes wishing they possessed, and I will do everything in my power to help you develop and protect it. The boy's thin shoulders shook with suppressed emotion, his throat tightening. You will leave eventually, he said, his voice cracking with barely suppressed emotion. All the governesses leave. And then I will be alone again with only my hidden drawings, which father will eventually find and destroy like he did before. Then we shall be extraordinarily careful about where and how we keep them, Arabella replied firmly. And in the meantime I shall teach you everything I learned from the artistic sisters at the convent about composition and perspective and color theory, and the great masters whose works have survived centuries, if you will permit me to do so. Oliver nodded mutely, unable to speak through the tightness in his throat, and Arabella felt her heart simultaneously break and mend. This boy had been told repeatedly that his greatest gift was worthless, that his deepest passion was shameful. How many times had he been forced to hide his true self to avoid his father's cold disapproval? She turned finally to Caroline, knowing this would be the most delicate conversation of all. The little girl sat perfectly still, her hands still folded with unnatural precision, her expression still devastatingly empty. "Miss Caroline," Arabella said softly, kneeling once more beside the small desk. "I know you do not speak. Mrs. Dalton explained that to me. I will not ask you to speak if you do not wish to, and I will never force you or pressure you, but I wonder if you might be willing to answer my question in another way, perhaps through gesture or writing. What do you love most in the world?" The child's grey eyes flickered briefly to her brother's, then back to Arabella's face. Then slowly, with movements that suggested she feared being struck or punished for this simple action, Caroline reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small wooden bird, carved with exquisite attention to detail. Its wings were spread wide as though captured in the moment of flight, its tiny beak open, as though frozen in the middle of a joyful song. "Your mother made this for you?" Arabella guessed gently. Caroline nodded once, and for the first time since Arabella had entered the room, something resembling genuine emotion crossed the child's small face. Grief, raw and profound, and still devastatingly fresh, despite 4 years of passage. But also love, fierce and protective and enduring. "It is truly beautiful," Arabella said, and she meant it with her entire heart. "And I think your mother would be very pleased to know you carry it with you and treasure it so carefully. Birds sing, do they not? Beautiful songs that make the whole world feel lighter and brighter. Perhaps one day when you are ready, you will sing again too, but only when you are ready, and only if you wish to." The little girl's eyes widened slightly, and Arabella thought she saw the faintest trembling of Caroline's lower lip, as though some deeply buried emotion was fighting desperately to surface. But Caroline did not cry, did not speak, did not make any sound at all. She simply clutched her precious wooden bird more tightly in her small hand and nodded once more, very slowly. Arabella rose carefully and returned to the front of the classroom, looking at these 3 profoundly broken children and feeling the enormous, almost crushing weight of the responsibility she had just accepted. They had been taught systematically that perfection was the only acceptable standard, that passion was shameful weakness, that expressing genuine emotion was dangerous. They had been taught to make themselves small and silent and safe, to bury everything authentic about themselves, where it could not be judged and found wanting. She would have to help them learn to be themselves again, despite everything their grief-stricken father and their cold, judgmental world had taught them. "Very well," she said, her voice firm but genuinely warm. "Let us begin our first proper lesson with some language study. Master James, I understand from your records that you have been studying French for several years now. Would you please demonstrate your knowledge by providing the present tense forms of the verb meaning to love?" James stood immediately, his posture militarily perfect. He recited the conjugation flawlessly, his pronunciation quite good for an English boy who had likely never traveled to France. "Excellent pronunciation and perfect accuracy," Arabella said warmly. "Master Oliver, can you construct a sentence using one of those verb forms?" The boy hesitated visibly, clearly torn between his habitual resistance to authority and his desperate desire to please this new governess who had genuinely praised his forbidden drawings. Finally, he said quietly, in carefully pronounced French, that he loved to draw. "A perfect sentence," Arabella replied with a warm, genuine smile. "And entirely true, which makes it even more beautiful and powerful. Truth in language is always more meaningful than mere technical correctness. Miss Caroline, would you like to try as well? You may write your sentence on your slate if speaking feels too difficult right now." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched and deepened until Arabella wondered if she had pushed too hard, asked too much of this traumatized child. Then, with trembling hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the chalk, Caroline reached for her small slate. She wrote very slowly, her letters shaky and uncertain but ultimately legible. In French, she had written that she loved her mother. The silence that followed was absolutely profound. James's perfect military composure cracked visibly, his grey eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears he was desperately trying to control. Oliver turned quickly away toward the window, but not before Arabella clearly saw his thin shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. And Caroline herself simply stared at what she had written, as though deeply surprised by her own courage in acknowledging this fundamental truth. "That," Arabella said very softly, her own voice thick with emotion, "is perhaps the most honest and beautiful sentence I have ever had the privilege of hearing. Thank you for sharing it with us, Miss Caroline. Your mother was extraordinarily fortunate to have a daughter who loved her so dearly and who continues to love her still." The lesson continued after that profound moment, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of the schoolroom. The walls felt somehow less oppressive, the silence less absolute and crushing. For the first time in years, perhaps since their mother's death, these children had been given explicit permission to be truthful about their deepest feelings, and the relief was almost physically palpable in the room. As Arabella carefully guided them through French grammar, then Roman history, then basic mathematical principles, she became increasingly aware of a presence just outside the schoolroom door. She could not see him directly, but she could feel the weight of his intense observation, could sense someone listening with absolute attention to everything being said within these walls. The Duke was watching them, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, and she wondered with genuine curiosity what he made of this scene, this small quiet revolution of honesty and gentle encouragement that stood in such stark contrast to the harsh discipline and emotional suppression he had explicitly demanded. Would he be pleased by her methods, outraged by her defiance, or simply confused by this woman who absolutely refused to break his children's spirits in the name of preparing them for a cruel and unforgiving world? The morning passed with surprising speed, and when Arabella finally dismissed the children for their midday meal, James hesitated noticeably at the door, clearly wanting to say something but unsure if he should. "Yes, Master James," Arabella prompted gently. "Miss Winters, I wanted to thank you for asking what we love. No one has asked us that question before. No one has seemed to care what we actually feel about anything." "Your capacity for love is not a weakness, Master James," she replied with absolute sincerity. "It is the greatest strength any human being can possibly possess. Never forget that truth, no matter what anyone else tells you." After the children departed, Arabella stood alone in the suddenly quiet schoolroom, looking out the tall window at the extensive grounds of Silverton Hall. The house was vast and beautifully situated on rolling hills, but it held a general, pervasive air of a place that had simply stopped caring about itself. A house in deep mourning, she thought sadly. A house that had completely forgotten how to live, how to find joy in simple daily existence. But perhaps, with infinite patience and quiet courage, she could help it remember what it had lost. She did not see the Duke still standing motionless in the shadows of the corridor outside, his expression deeply troubled and utterly unreadable, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, as though he were physically restraining himself from some powerful impulse. She did not see the way his jaw tightened painfully when she spoke of love as strength rather than weakness, or the way something very old and carefully buried stirred dangerously in his chest, threatening the carefully constructed walls he had spent 4 agonizing years building around his devastated heart. Edmund Hartwell had spent 4 long years methodically building impenetrable walls around every vulnerable feeling, absolutely convinced that feeling nothing was infinitely safer than risking the complete devastation of profound loss ever again. But this woman, with her 6 impossible languages and her soft, compassionate words and her absolute refusal to crush his children's fragile spirits, had just demonstrated something he had forgotten was even possible in this cold world. That kindness, when delivered with genuine strength and unwavering conviction, could be more truly powerful than any amount of harsh discipline or cold indifference. And he honestly did not know whether to be profoundly grateful or utterly terrified by that dangerous revelation. The days that followed brought an unexpected and almost magical transformation to the carefully ordered world of Silverton Hall. Arabella rose each morning well before dawn, prepared her lessons with meticulous care and genuine enthusiasm, and met her 3 students in the schoolroom at precisely 8 o'clock, as the Duke had commanded. But what actually happened within those walls during those precious hours bore absolutely no resemblance to the stern, joyless education the Duke had explicitly prescribed. She taught them French not through tedious rote memorization, but by having them read and translate beautiful poetry, allowing them to discover that language could be genuinely beautiful and emotionally moving, as well as merely functional and utilitarian. She taught them history by focusing not merely on dry dates and military battles, but on the compelling human stories behind great historical events, helping them understand that the past had been populated by real people with hopes and fears and dreams remarkably similar to their own. She taught them mathematics through practical problems that genuinely engaged their natural curiosity rather than simply demanding mindless memorization of abstract formulas. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the children began to transform before her eyes. James, the painfully perfect heir who lived in constant terror of making any mistake, gradually started to ask genuine questions rather than simply reciting memorized answers in that flat, emotionless voice. His posture remained impeccable, his academic work still absolutely flawless, but there was a new quality to his attention during lessons. He listened now, not because he feared harsh punishment for any lapse in attention, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the material being presented. Oliver began tentatively bringing his forbidden drawings to lessons, no longer hiding them shamefully beneath his desk, as though they were evidence of some terrible crime. Arabella kept her promise faithfully, teaching him everything she had learned from the artistic sisters, who were often refugees of revolution and liberal thought, about perspective and composition and color theory. She showed him how the great Renaissance masters had used mathematical geometry to create the powerful illusion of three-dimensional depth on flat surfaces, how subtle manipulation of light and shadow could convey complex human emotion as powerfully as any carefully chosen words. The boy absorbed absolutely everything with hungry, almost desperate intensity. His considerable natural gift flourished under such careful and knowledgeable cultivation. And Caroline, silent, traumatized Caroline, with her devastating emptiness, began to engage in small but meaningful ways. She still could not speak, or perhaps simply chose not to, but she would write brief messages on her slate in response to questions, answer inquiries with careful nods and shakes of her dark curls, and occasionally, when she thought absolutely no one was watching her, Arabella would catch the child humming very softly to herself, barely audible melodies that might have been half-remembered lullabies from before the terrible loss. It was genuine progress, slow, fragile, sometimes frustratingly inconsistent progress, but real measurable progress nonetheless. The Duke, however, remained a distant, coldly disapproving presence throughout the house. Arabella would occasionally glimpse him in dim corridors or see him riding alone across the grounds at dawn, but he never once entered the schoolroom during lessons, never inquired directly about his children's education or emotional state. It was as though, having hired a governess to fulfill his parental obligations, he had thereby absolved himself of any further personal responsibility for their development or well-being. Until the morning he informed her about the critically important diplomatic dinner. Mrs. Dalton appeared unexpectedly in the schoolroom doorway exactly 3 weeks after Arabella's arrival, her normally composed expression noticeably harried and anxious. "Miss Winters, His Grace requests your immediate presence in his study. He says it is a matter of considerable urgency." Arabella excused herself quickly from the children, who exchanged worried glances among themselves, clearly afraid this summons meant their new governess was about to be dismissed like all the others. She followed the housekeeper through the now familiar maze of corridors, with her heart beating considerably faster than she would have liked to admit. What could the Duke possibly want with her that qualified as genuinely urgent? She found him standing rigidly by the window of his book-lined study, his back held unnaturally straight, his hands clasped tightly behind him in a posture that radiated tension. He did not turn to face her when she entered the room. "Your Grace, you wish to see me?" "The French ambassador to England is visiting this evening," the Duke said abruptly, still refusing to turn and face her directly. "His Excellency Monsieur Beaumont and his wife will dine here at Silverton Hall, along with several other notably important members of the diplomatic community. It is a matter of considerable political and economic importance to England's ongoing relationship with France." "I see," Arabella said carefully, genuinely uncertain where this conversation was leading. "I require your assistance with the evening." The words seemed to physically pain him to speak. "Your purported fluency in French may prove useful during dinner conversation if technical matters arise. You will join us at table in a capacity as linguistic consultant." Arabella felt a complex flutter of emotions that might have been fear or excitement or some confusing combination of both. "Your Grace, I am merely a governess. It would be highly irregular, possibly even scandalous, for me to dine with your distinguished guests. Many things about this household have become irregular since your arrival, Miss Winters." Finally, he turned slowly to face her, and she was genuinely struck by the visible tension in his aristocratic features. "You have made that abundantly clear through your teaching methods over these past 3 weeks. This is not a polite request or a favor I am asking. It is a direct command from your employer. You will attend the dinner. You will sit at the far end of the table where you can be summoned if your linguistic expertise becomes necessary, and you will speak only when explicitly addressed by myself or one of the guests. Is that absolutely understood?" "Yes, Your Grace." "And Miss Winters?" His storm-grey eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity that made her want to look away, but somehow prevented her from doing so. "If your repeated claims of linguistic mastery prove to have been exaggerated in any way, if you embarrass me or this household before these critically important guests, you will be dismissed immediately without reference or compensation. I trust I have made myself perfectly clear on this point." "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." He dismissed her with a curt nod, and Arabella returned to the schoolroom with her mind racing through possibilities. Why would the Duke of Silverton, a man of his obvious education and elevated social position, need her assistance with French conversation during a diplomatic dinner? Surely a duke would speak French fluently as a basic requirement of his class and education, unless there was something preventing him from doing so effectively. The thought struck her with sudden, startling clarity. What if he struggled significantly with languages? What if all his dismissive bluster and contemptuous attitude had been carefully designed to mask some profound insecurity or limitation? But that possibility seemed nearly impossible to accept. The Duke of Silverton was one of the most powerful and influential men in all of England. Surely he had received every conceivable advantage of education that vast wealth and aristocratic position could possibly provide. That evening, Arabella dressed with meticulous care in the only evening gown she still possessed. A simple but elegant creation in deep sapphire blue silk that had definitely seen far better days, but still maintained a certain quiet dignity and grace. Mrs. Dalton helped her arrange her dark hair in a style appropriately formal for such an occasion, and when Arabella finally studied her reflection in the small tarnished mirror of her modest chamber, she saw a woman who looked neither particularly grand nor fashionably dressed, but whose carriage suggested a finely honed intelligence and spirit. She descended to the drawing room at precisely 7 o'clock, exactly as instructed, and found the distinguished company already gathering in small conversational groups. The French ambassador was a remarkably distinguished man in his late 50s, his bearing naturally regal, his expensive clothes impeccably tailored in the latest Parisian fashion. His wife, Madame Beaumont, was a striking beauty of perhaps 40 years, her elaborate dress representing the absolute height of sophisticated French style. There were also 2 prominent English lords whom Arabella vaguely recognized from her father's better days before his catastrophic fall, Lord Waverley and Lord Sinclair, along with their elegantly dressed wives who regarded Arabella with barely concealed curiosity and subtle disapproval. And there was Lady Constance Hartwell, the Duke's formidable maiden aunt, a woman clad in a style of unyielding sobriety, of perhaps 58 years, whose sharp expression suggested she had detected something deeply unpleasant and was determined to identify and eliminate it. "Edmund," Lady Constance said with audible sharpness as Arabella entered the room, "who precisely is this person, and why is she present?" "Miss Winters is governess to my children," the Duke replied with deliberate coolness. "She joins us this evening because she speaks French fluently, and may prove useful if complex technical discussions arise that require linguistic precision." Lady Constance's eyes narrowed with obvious displeasure and suspicion. A common governess dining at table with the French ambassador? This is highly irregular and potentially scandalous. Surely His Grace is aware that such a lowering of the tone must inevitably lead to the most tiresome gossip. "They will say that the Duke of Silverton does precisely as he pleases in his own home, without requiring anyone's permission or approval," Edmund replied, his voice carrying a distinct warning edge. "Miss Winters, you will sit here at the end of the table, as we discussed." Arabella took her assigned seat with as much quiet dignity as she could manage, acutely and uncomfortably aware of all the eyes upon her, the barely audible whispered speculations, the thinly concealed disapproval radiating from multiple sources. She kept her own gaze carefully lowered, her hands folded properly in her lap, and tried with limited success to make herself as unobtrusive as physically possible. The elaborate dinner began with all the customary formality expected at such an important diplomatic occasion. Multiple courses were served with practiced efficiency by well-trained servants. Polite conversation flowed in carefully controlled channels of appropriately neutral topics, and Arabella remained perfectly silent, as explicitly instructed, speaking to no one. She noticed with growing concern, however, that as the evening progressed steadily, the French ambassador's conversation was becoming increasingly technical and specialized, touching on genuinely complex matters of international trade agreements, maritime law, and delicate diplomatic protocols between their two nations. And she noticed something else that made her genuinely anxious. The Duke's responses were becoming progressively more stilted and hesitant, his pauses growing noticeably longer, his facial expressions more visibly tense and strained. He was clearly struggling to follow the increasingly rapid and technical French being spoken. Then Monsieur Beaumont launched enthusiastically into a lengthy and detailed discourse on the extremely fine points of a proposed commercial treaty, speaking very rapidly in French and using highly specialized diplomatic and legal vocabulary that would challenge even native speakers. Arabella listened with mounting alarm as she realized with absolute certainty that the Duke was not fully understanding the ambassador's essential points and nuanced arguments. His responses were growing dangerously vague and non-committal, clearly attempting to mask his genuine confusion and comprehension difficulties. Finally, the ambassador asked a very direct and specific question about England's official position on a particularly contentious clause in the proposed treaty, and the Duke gave an answer that was not merely vague, but potentially diplomatically disastrous, carelessly suggesting a level of rigid inflexibility that would almost certainly deeply offend the French delegation and potentially damage delicate international relations. Arabella saw Monsieur Beaumont's aristocratic expression shift noticeably, observed the subtle but unmistakable stiffening of his formal posture that clearly indicated genuine offense had been taken. In that critical moment, she made a decision that would fundamentally change absolutely everything about her position in this household. She interrupted, speaking clearly in absolutely flawless and technically precise French, begging the ambassador's pardon and explaining that she believed there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding His Grace's actual position on the matter. With diplomatic skill she had not known she possessed, she smoothly corrected the miscommunication, carefully reframed the Duke's stated position in terms that were both diplomatically appropriate and substantively accurate, and gently guided the increasingly tense conversation back to safer, less contentious ground. The ambassador's expression transformed visibly from offense to surprise to something approaching genuine professional approval. He complimented her French warmly, asking in the language where she had studied to achieve such remarkable fluency and precision. She explained about her 18 years at the Convent of the Sacred Heart in France, and then, seized by the relief of finally being seen, she found herself demonstrating the full extent of her considerable linguistic abilities. The ambassador asked if she spoke other languages, and what followed was something Arabella had not consciously planned, but seemed unable to prevent once it began. She switched seamlessly to Italian, explaining that yes, she spoke that language fluently as well. Then to German, demonstrating her command of that complex tongue. Then she briefly demonstrated her knowledge of ancient Greek by quoting a famous philosophical passage. Finally, she concluded with a brief Latin phrase from classical literature. The absolute silence that followed her demonstration was profound and uncomfortable. Every eye in the room was fixed upon her, with varying expressions of shock, admiration, or outrage. Madame Beaumont's delicate fan had stopped mid-flutter and hung frozen in the air. Lord Waverley had set down his crystal wine-glass with an audible clink against the... Lady Constance looked as though she might actually expire from sheer scandalized outrage, and the Duke's aristocratic face had gone completely white with shock, then flushed dark red with what could only be barely suppressed fury. It was Lord Sinclair who finally broke the terrible silence, his cultured voice filled with genuine amazement and professional respect. "Good God, Miss Winters, that is truly extraordinary. I have never personally encountered such remarkable linguistic proficiency outside of university professors who have devoted their entire careers to such studies." "Indeed," Monsieur Beaumont agreed with obvious warmth and approval. "Mademoiselle, you are absolutely wasted in your current position as a mere governess. You should be teaching at the Sorbonne or serving in diplomatic circles. Such talent and training is extraordinarily rare." Arabella felt a color rise in her cheeks, a combination of embarrassment and pride, but she kept her voice carefully steady and appropriately modest. "You are very kind, monsieur, but I am quite genuinely content in my current position with the Duke's children." "Clearly," Lady Constance said with icy precision and barely concealed contempt, "the young woman has forgotten her proper place entirely. Edmund, this behavior is absolutely unconscionable. A common governess interrupting important diplomatic conversation, deliberately drawing excessive attention to herself in such a vulgar and inappropriate manner, making a spectacle before distinguished guests." "With profound respect, Your Grace," Lord Sinclair interjected quietly but firmly, "Miss Winters has just saved this evening from potential diplomatic disaster. That miscommunication with the ambassador could very well have had serious negative political and economic consequences for England's relationship with France. Miss Winters's intervention was both extraordinarily timely and remarkably tactful under difficult circumstances." The Duke rose abruptly from the table with rigid, barely controlled movements that radiated suppressed emotion. "If you will all please excuse me, I find I am suddenly quite fatigued from the evening's exertions. Miss Winters, you will attend me in the library immediately. That is not a request." He left the dining room without waiting for any response, and Arabella felt her stomach drop sickeningly. She had just thoroughly humiliated him before his most important guests, had publicly revealed his linguistic inadequacy and limitations, had overstepped absolutely every boundary of propriety and appropriate behavior for someone in her position. She would certainly be dismissed now, sent away without any reference or compensation, just exactly as he had explicitly warned her would happen. But as she followed him silently to the library, she found to her own surprise that she did not genuinely regret what she had done. The critical political alliance had been preserved through her intervention. The ambassador had not been seriously offended, and relations remained positive. And she had finally told the complete truth about her considerable abilities, something she had spent far too many painful years hiding and minimizing to make other people more comfortable with her presence. The Duke stood with his back rigidly turned to the heavy door when she entered the book-lined library, his hands gripping the polished edge of his massive desk so tightly that his knuckles had gone completely white with the strain. Arabella closed the door very quietly behind her and simply waited in tense silence for the explosion she knew was inevitable. "You deliberately humiliated me," he said finally, his voice dangerously low and tightly controlled. "In my own home, before guests of considerable political importance and social standing, you made an absolute fool of me and exposed my limitations for everyone present to witness and judge." "I prevented a genuine diplomatic disaster," Arabella replied. working hard to keep her voice calm and measured despite her rapidly racing heart. The ambassador was becoming seriously offended by what he perceived as insulting inflexibility. Lord Sinclair noticed the growing tension immediately. Another few moments of miscommunication, and you would have caused a real and potentially damaging breach in delicate international relations. The Duke whirled suddenly to face her directly, his storm-grey eyes absolutely blazing, with barely suppressed fury and something else she could not quite identify. Do not presume to lecture me about what I would or would not have caused through my own diplomatic efforts. You who are so insufferably proud of your linguistic accomplishments, who parade your convent education as though it somehow compensates for your complete lack of proper birth, your utter absence of social position, your total lack of understanding about how the real world actually functions at the highest levels of power. The words were carefully designed to wound deeply, and they succeeded admirably in their cruel purpose. Arabella recoiled from the cruel accuracy of the words, that sickeningly familiar burn of shame and profound inadequacy that had haunted and tormented her since her father's disgraceful death and financial ruin. But beneath the shame and pain, something else entirely was stirring powerfully within her. Something that had been slowly building in intensity since the very first moment she had arrived at grief-stricken Silverton Hall. Pure, righteous anger at injustice. "I speak 6 languages, Your Grace," she said, her voice rising steadily despite her very best efforts to maintain control. "Not 5 languages, as you seem absolutely determined to believe despite all evidence, but 6 complete languages. French, Italian, German, Latin, Ancient Greek, and English. I learned them not to compensate for anything I lack, but because the extraordinarily kind sisters at the convent loved me enough to recognize my potential and carefully nurture it when no one else cared. I learned them because when you have genuinely lost absolutely everything, when your father has died in complete public disgrace, and your family's once respected name is utterly ruined, and you have nowhere left to go, and no one remaining to turn to for help or shelter, books become your only true family. Knowledge becomes your safest refuge from a cruel world. Language becomes the only valuable thing that absolutely no one can ever take away from you, no matter how hard they try." The Duke's rigid expression shifted noticeably, something complex flickering in his eyes that might have been surprise or painful recognition or unwilling understanding, but Arabella found she was not remotely finished speaking her truth. "You asked me once if I thought you a fool, Your Grace. I did not think so then, despite your cruel treatment, and I honestly do not think so now, despite everything. But I think you are a profoundly lonely man, who has completely forgotten what it truly means to be vulnerable with another human being, what it genuinely costs to admit you desperately need help, what it feels like to be harshly judged and found wanting through absolutely no fault of your own. And I think," she continued, her voice dropping in volume but losing absolutely none of its passionate intensity, "that you have systematically inflicted that same harsh judgment and cold emotional isolation on 3 innocent children who deserve so very much better from the one single person in this entire world who should love them completely and unconditionally, regardless of their imperfections." The profound silence that followed her passionate words seemed to fill the entire library like something physical and oppressive. The Duke stared at her as though truly seeing her for the very first time, his carefully maintained aristocratic composure visibly cracking to reveal something raw and wounded beneath the cold defensive surface. "You know absolutely nothing of what I have personally endured," he said finally, his voice hoarse with powerful emotion he was clearly struggling desperately to contain. "Nothing whatsoever of profound loss, of crushing grief that never ends, of the impossible burden of responsibility that systematically crushes every small moment of potential joy before it can fully form and take root." "You are absolutely right," Arabella replied, her voice gentler now, but still completely honest. "I genuinely do not know what it is to lose a dearly beloved spouse, to raise children entirely alone in grief, to carry the enormous weight of a dukedom on your shoulders every single day. But I do know with absolute certainty what it is to be harshly judged for circumstances completely beyond my control. And I know that your children are suffering terribly, not because you are deliberately cruel to them, but because you are deeply afraid. afraid that if you love them too openly, too freely, too completely, you might lose them exactly as you lost their mother. But Your Grace, she said very softly now, refusing to love them openly does not actually protect you from experiencing loss. It simply ensures with certainty that you have forfeited their deepest affection while they still live and breathe and desperately need you. The Duke turned away from her abruptly, and Arabella saw his broad shoulders shake almost imperceptibly. For a long suspended moment, neither of them spoke nor moved. When he finally turned back to face her again, his aristocratic expression was carefully neutral once more, meticulously controlled, but his grey eyes were unmistakably bright with moisture he absolutely refused to allow to fall. "You are dismissed from your position, Miss Winters," he said very quietly, his voice carefully flat. "I will expect your complete departure by tomorrow morning. Mrs. Dalton will arrange appropriate transportation." Arabella received the cold words like a genuine physical blow to her chest, but she kept her spine absolutely straight with hard-won dignity. "As you wish, Your Grace. But before I leave permanently, I would ask one final thing of you." "What?" "Do not abandon your children entirely after I am gone. They genuinely need you, whether you currently believe yourself capable of meeting that need or not. They need their father, not another cold replacement, and they need you before it becomes too late to repair what has been broken." She left the library without waiting for his response, moving quickly through the shadowed corridors, with her vision blurring with tears she absolutely refused to shed, where anyone might witness her pain. In the library, Edmund Hartwell did not move. Her final devastating observation about his fear had struck him like a physical blow to the heart, shattering the 4-year foundation of his pride. In her small, modest chamber, she began mechanically packing her few possessions, her hands moving automatically while her mind raced. Where would she go now? Without a reference from the Duke, securing another respectable position would be nearly impossible. She might be forced to accept work as a paid companion or even a common servant. The future stretched before her, bleak and uncertain, but she would survive this, just as she had survived her father's death and ruin. She would find a way forward, because she always had. A soft knock came at her door near midnight. When she opened it cautiously, she found James standing in the darkened corridor, still fully dressed, his young face streaked with tears he had clearly been trying unsuccessfully to hide. "Miss Winters, is it true? Are you really leaving us tomorrow?" "I am afraid so, Master James. Your father has dismissed me from my position." "Because you helped him at dinner? Because you saved him from making a terrible mistake?" The boy's voice cracked with emotion and incomprehension. "That makes absolutely no sense. You helped him. You helped all of us." "Sometimes, Master James, pride can be more powerful than gratitude, especially when someone feels they have been made to look weak or inadequate before others. Your father is a very proud man who has suffered greatly. My presence has become uncomfortable for him." "Please do not go," James whispered desperately. "You are the only person who has ever truly seen us, who has ever cared what we actually feel. Oliver will go back to hiding his drawings and hating himself. Caroline will disappear back into her silence forever, and I will go back to being terrified every single moment of making one single mistake. Please, Miss Winters, please stay." Arabella felt her heart break completely. She pulled the boy into a gentle embrace, feeling him shake with suppressed sobs against her shoulder. "You must promise me something very important, Master James. Promise me you will remember what we discussed in these past 3 weeks. That your worth is not determined by perfection. That loving openly is strength, not weakness. That your capacity for feeling deeply is your greatest gift, not a flaw to be eliminated. Can you promise to remember those truths?" "I promise," he managed through tears, "but it will be so much harder without you here to remind us." After James finally returned reluctantly to his own chambers, Arabella sat awake for hours, watching the moon track slowly across the sky outside her window. She thought about the Duke, isolated in his grief and fear. She thought about 3 children slowly learning to hope again, only to have that fragile hope crushed by her departure. She thought about her own uncertain future stretching ahead into darkness. And she thought about languages, about the power of words to build bridges or create walls, to heal or to wound. She did not sleep that night. And when dawn finally came, pale and cold, she rose and prepared herself for departure, her heart heavy but her conscience clear. She had done her best. Sometimes that had to be enough, even when it felt nowhere close to sufficient. But she did not know that in another part of the great house, the Duke of Silverton had also not slept that night, that he had spent those dark hours thinking about a woman who spoke 6 languages, who saw his children as human beings rather than disappointing failures, who had dared to tell him painful truths he desperately needed to hear. And he did not know what to do with the terrifying realization that he did not want her to leave at all. The morning of Arabella's planned departure dawned cold and grey, with persistent rain drumming steadily against the windows of Silverton Hall, like tears the house itself was weeping. Arabella dressed carefully in her travelling clothes, secured her modest trunk with practiced efficiency, and prepared to face the children one final time before her departure. But when she descended to the entrance hall at the appointed hour, she found not merely the children waiting for her, but an unexpected and oddly formal gathering that made her heart skip with confused apprehension. The Duke stood at the center of the marble-floored space, looking as though he had not slept at all during the night. His usually impeccable appearance was subtly disheveled, his cravat less than perfectly tied, shadows of exhaustion dark beneath his storm-grey eyes. The 3 children stood nearby in a tight, protective cluster. James's young face was set in lines of grim determination. Oliver clutched his forbidden sketchpad to his chest like a shield, and Caroline, silent, Caroline, was actually crying, tears streaming steadily down her small face, though she made no sound at all. Mrs. Dalton stood discreetly near the service corridor, her weathered face carefully neutral, but her eyes unmistakably sympathetic. "Miss Winters," the Duke said formally as Arabella reached the bottom of the grand staircase. His voice sounded labored and strained. "Before you depart permanently, there is something I must say to you. Something I should have said last night but was too proud and too afraid to acknowledge." Arabella stopped on the final step, her hand gripping the banister for support. "Your Grace, I owe you a profound apology." The words seemed to cost him enormous effort to speak aloud. "You were absolutely correct in your assessment last evening. I have allowed my grief and my fear to transform me into someone I never intended to become. Someone cold and harsh, and utterly unable to show love to the 3 people who matter most in this world. Someone who valued pride over truth and appearance over genuine connection." The children's eyes widened with shock. None of them had ever heard their father speak with such raw honesty before. "You were also correct about my linguistic limitations," he continued, each word clearly difficult but deliberately chosen. "I struggle significantly with reading and comprehension. The letters swam before my eyes, a confusing blur of meaningless marks, a difficulty I have spent my entire adult life attempting to hide from everyone, including myself. The formal education expected of someone in my position was a source of constant humiliation and shame. I learned to mask my difficulties with arrogance and dismissiveness, to attack others before they could discover my inadequacies. When you demonstrated such effortless mastery of multiple languages last evening, it forced me to confront everything I had been denying about myself." "Your Grace," Arabella began, but he raised his hand gently. "Please, let me finish before my courage fails entirely. You also said that I have inflicted harsh judgment on my children, and in this too you were devastatingly correct. I have been so terrified of losing them as I lost their mother that I refuse to truly love them openly, convincing myself that maintaining emotional distance was somehow protection. Instead, I've only ensured they feel utterly alone in their grief, while their father remains physically present but emotionally absent." He turned finally to face his children, and Arabella saw raw emotion on his aristocratic face for the first time since she had arrived at Silverton Hall. "James," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you do not need to be perfect to earn my love or approval. I am so very proud of the young man you are becoming, not because you never make mistakes, but because you face each day with courage and integrity, despite how thoroughly I have failed you as a father." James's carefully controlled composure shattered completely. Tears began streaming down his face as he stared at his father in shock and desperate hope. "Oliver," the Duke continued, Your artistic gift is not shameful or worthless. It is extraordinary and precious. I was wrong to burn your drawings. I was wrong to make you feel that your passion was something to hide. I would very much like to see your work, if you would be willing to share it with me now." Oliver's arms tightened protectively around his sketchpad, but then, slowly trembling, he extended it toward his father. The Duke took it with careful reverence, opening the leather cover and studying the drawings within. Arabella watched his expression transform from cautious interest to genuine awe. "These are truly remarkable, Oliver. You have a gift that deserves to be celebrated and cultivated, not hidden and suppressed. Will you teach me about art? I know very little, but I would very much like to learn from you." The boy nodded mutely, unable to speak through his overwhelming emotion. And then the Duke knelt, bringing himself down to Caroline's level, just as Arabella had done on that first morning. The little girl stared at her father with wide, tear-filled eyes as he gently took her small hands in his larger ones. "My darling Caroline," he said very softly, "I know you cannot speak right now, and I understand why. Losing your mother hurt you so deeply that words seemed inadequate and dangerous. But I want you to know that whether you ever speak again or not, I love you completely and unconditionally. You do not need to earn my love through any particular behavior or achievement. You have my love simply because you exist, because you are my precious daughter, and nothing will ever change that fundamental truth." Caroline stared at her father for a long, suspended moment. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and withdrew the small wooden bird her mother had made. She held it out to him, offering to share this most precious possession. The Duke's eyes filled with tears. He no longer tried to hide. "Your mother made this for you before she became ill. I remember watching her carve it, spending hours getting every detail exactly right because she loved you so very much. She would be so pleased to know you still carry it with you." And then something utterly extraordinary happened. Something no one in that house had witnessed in 4 long years. Caroline's lips parted slightly. Her small voice, rusty from years of disuse, emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Papa." Just that single word. But it shattered the Duke completely. He pulled his daughter into his arms and wept openly, great shaking sobs of grief and joy and overwhelming relief. James and Oliver rushed to join them, and suddenly all 4 members of the family were embracing, crying together for the first time since Rosalind's death. Arabella watched, tears streaming down her own face as this profound healing began to take root. This was what these children had desperately needed all along. Not perfection, not harsh discipline, but simply genuine love openly expressed. After several long minutes, the Duke finally released his children, wiping his eyes somewhat sheepishly. He stood and turned back to face Arabella, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Miss Winters, I dismissed you last evening in anger and wounded pride, but I am asking you now, not commanding but genuinely asking, if you would consider remaining at Silverton Hall, not merely as governess to my children, though they clearly need your exceptional skills and genuine compassion, but also if you would be willing, as my personal tutor. You have a gift for teaching, for making knowledge accessible and engaging rather than shameful and difficult. I would very much like to learn from you if you can find it in your heart to forgive my previous cruelty and arrogance." Arabella felt her heart race with hope, and something else she dared not yet name. "Your Grace, I would be honored to remain and assist in whatever capacity you feel would be most beneficial." He waited, hands clenched, the most vulnerable he had ever been. "There is one more thing," the Duke said, and now he looked genuinely nervous. "Over these past 3 weeks I have observed you with my children. I have seen their transformation under your gentle guidance. I have witnessed your patience, your wisdom, your unwillingness to crush spirits in the name of preparation for a harsh world. And I have come to realize something that terrifies me almost as much as it fills me with hope." He took a step closer to her, and Arabella felt her breath catch. "I have come to deeply admire you, Miss Winters, your strength, your intelligence, your compassionate heart. And I find myself wishing very much to know you better, not as an employee in my household, but as a woman whose company I genuinely value and desire. Would you permit me the honor of spending time together, of perhaps taking walks in the gardens, of conversing as equals rather than employer and employee?" Arabella's heart was now beating so rapidly she felt lightheaded. "Your Grace, I am merely a ruined merchant's daughter with no prospects and no position in society. You are a duke. Such a connection would be considered scandalous and inappropriate by everyone. I have spent 4 years living, according to what everyone else considered appropriate," he replied quietly. "It nearly destroyed me and my children. Perhaps it is time I began living according to what feels true and right to my own heart, regardless of society's judgment. But only if you are willing. I will not command this, Arabella. I am simply asking if you might give me the chance to prove I can be better than the man you first met 3 weeks ago." He had used her given name, she realized. Not Miss Winters, but Arabella. The intimacy of it sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "I would like that very much, Edmund," she replied softly, daring to use his name in return. His expression transformed with joy and relief. "Then you will stay?" "I will stay." The children erupted in delighted celebration, even Caroline managing a small smile through her tears. Mrs. Dalton appeared with refreshments, as though she had been anticipating this exact outcome, her weathered face creased with genuine happiness. Over the weeks and months that followed, Silverton Hall slowly transformed from a house of mourning into a home filled with life and laughter once more. Arabella continued teaching the children, watching them flourish as they were finally permitted to be themselves without fear or shame. James gradually learned to relax his impossible standards, to accept that mistakes were part of learning rather than evidence of failure. Oliver's artistic talent flourished under encouragement, his drawings becoming more confident and technically skilled with each passing week. And Caroline, after that first single word to her father, slowly began speaking more regularly, her voice growing stronger as she felt safer expressing herself. But the most remarkable transformation was in Edmund himself. Under Arabella's patient, skillful tutelage, he began to understand that his struggles with reading were not evidence of stupidity or inadequacy, but simply a different way his mind processed written information. She taught him techniques the sisters at the convent had learned from working with various students, methods that made comprehension easier and less frustrating. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to experience the joy of reading rather than the shame of struggling. And as he learned to be more gentle with himself, he became more gentle with everyone around him. Their courtship was unconventional and occasionally scandalous, exactly as Arabella had predicted. Society matrons gossiped about the Duke of Silverton courting his children's governess. Lady Constance wrote several strongly worded letters expressing her profound disapproval. But Edmund discovered he cared far less about society's judgment than he had ever imagined possible. What mattered was the woman who walked beside him through the gardens, discussing philosophy and poetry with equal passion. What mattered was watching his children's faces light up when Arabella entered a room. What mattered was the way his heart felt lighter than it had in years, as though some crushing weight had finally been lifted. 6 months after that rainy morning when she had almost left forever, Edmund proposed to Arabella in the library, where they had first truly confronted each other with painful honesty. It was fitting, he thought, that this room which had witnessed their harshest words should also witness their most tender ones. "Arabella," he said, taking both her hands in his, "you have taught me that knowledge is not merely information accumulated, but wisdom applied with compassion. You have taught my children that they are worthy of love exactly as they are. And you have taught me that opening one's heart, despite the risk of potential pain, is far better than living behind walls of fear and isolation. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she said simply, tears of joy streaming down her face. 1,000 times, yes. The wedding took place 3 months later in the small chapel on the Silverton estate, with only close friends and family in attendance. Lady Constance attended but maintained a disapproving silence throughout the ceremony. The French ambassador and his wife sent their warmest congratulations, along with an exquisite gift. And the children stood as witnesses, their faces radiant with genuine happiness for the first time in years. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Edmund kissed his bride with tender reverence, and the assembled guests erupted in applause. But the loudest sound came from Caroline, who shouted with childish enthusiasm that carried through the entire chapel and brought tears to everyone's eyes. Mama Arabella! Their life together demanded constant effort, patience, and the continuous compromise required to merge two disparate worlds. There were difficult moments when old patterns of behavior temporarily resurfaced, when fear threatened to overwhelm love. But they faced each challenge together, with honesty and compassion and unwavering commitment to each other's well-being. Arabella established a small school on the estate, teaching not only the Silverton children, but also children from the surrounding villages, whose families could not otherwise afford proper education. She believed passionately that knowledge should not be restricted to those with wealth and position, and Edmund supported her vision wholeheartedly, even contributing significantly to funding the enterprise. Edmund gradually took on greater responsibilities in Parliament, using his position and influence to advocate for educational reform and support for children from all social classes. His personal experience of struggling with learning differences made him particularly passionate about ensuring no child was dismissed as stupid or lazy simply because they processed information differently than their peers. James grew into a thoughtful young man who eventually attended Cambridge, where he studied both law and literature with equal passion. He never forgot the lessons Arabella had taught him about the value of gentleness alongside strength. Oliver became a renowned artist, his paintings eventually exhibited in prestigious galleries throughout Europe. He never forgot that his stepmother had been the first person to tell him his gift was precious rather than shameful. And Caroline, after years of patient healing, became a teacher herself, working alongside Arabella at the school and helping other children who had experienced trauma to find their voices again. 10 years after that cold April morning, when Arabella first arrived at grieving Silverton Hall, the family gathered in the same drawing room where she had first met the Duke. But how different everything looked now. The rooms were warm and welcoming, filled with flowers and light. The corridors echoed with laughter rather than heavy silence, and the people within the house walked with lightness rather than the crushing weight of unprocessed grief. Edmund sat with Arabella on a comfortable sofa, watching their children engage in animated conversation about their various pursuits and passions. Two younger children, fruit of his marriage to Arabella, played nearby on the carpet with wooden toys. "Do you ever regret it?" Edmund asked his wife quietly. "Marrying me despite the scandal, taking on 3 traumatized children, building a life that society still considers somewhat inappropriate for a duchess." Arabella smiled and took his hand. "I regret nothing. You gave me a family when I had none. You gave me purpose when I felt lost, and you taught me that love, genuine transformative love, is worth any amount of social disapproval or temporary difficulty. You taught me something far more valuable," Edmund replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "You taught me that true strength lies not in perfection or in hiding our vulnerabilities, but in having the courage to be authentically ourselves and to love others with open hearts despite the risk of pain. You taught me that knowledge is most powerful when shared generously rather than hoarded selfishly. And you taught me that the most valuable thing any of us can offer the world is our genuine, imperfect, wholehearted selves." Caroline, now 17 and poised, overheard her parents' conversation and smiled. "You know what I remember most clearly from that first morning when you arrived, Mama Arabella? You knelt down so you could look me in the eyes. You treated me like I mattered, like my silence was not a problem to be solved, but a choice to be respected. No one had done that since Mama Rosalind died. That single gesture gave me the first tiny spark of hope I had felt in 4 years. And I remember," Oliver added, now 20 and preparing for his first major gallery exhibition, "when you looked at my hidden drawings and called them extraordinary instead of shameful. You said art was for people brave enough to see the world truly and skilled enough to share that vision. Those words changed my entire life. They gave me permission to be myself, rather than constantly hiding who I really was." James, now 23 and recently qualified as a barrister, raised his glass. "I propose a toast to Arabella, who came to us as a governess, claiming to speak 6 languages, but gave us something far more valuable than linguistic expertise. She taught us the most important language of all, the language of unconditional love, honest communication, and genuine acceptance. To Mama Arabella, who proved that sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is simply the courage to be truthfully seen. Everyone raised their glasses, including the younger children who were still learning what these family stories meant, but understood they were important and precious. To Arabella, Edmund said softly, his grey eyes warm with love as he looked at his remarkable wife, who speaks 6 languages fluently, but whose most powerful gift has always been her ability to speak directly to the human heart, in words that heal rather than wound, that build bridges rather than walls, that remind us we are all worthy of love simply because we exist. As the evening continued with laughter and storytelling and the comfortable companionship of family who genuinely loved one another, Arabella felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. She had arrived at Silverton Hall broken and desperate, expecting only temporary employment before inevitable dismissal. Instead, she had found a family, a purpose, and a love she had never imagined possible. And she had learned something essential that she now taught to every student who entered her school. Regardless of their background or circumstances, knowledge is valuable and powerful, yes. The ability to speak multiple languages, to comprehend complex ideas, to engage with the world intellectually is undoubtedly a precious gift. But the most important thing any of us can learn is how to speak the universal language that transcends all cultural and linguistic barriers, the language of genuine compassion, of honest vulnerability, of brave, open-hearted love offered without expectation of perfect reciprocation. That language requires no formal education, no years in a convent, no prestigious credentials. It simply requires the courage to truly see each other, to honor each other's inherent worth, and to build lives together based on mutual respect and authentic connection. And that language Arabella had discovered was the one that truly changed the world. One honest conversation and one open heart at a time. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story of courage, redemption, and the transformative power of genuine love touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope, healing, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit.